Picture the year 2026 as a hospital hallway that suddenly splits into two corridors. One corridor is brighter, faster, cheaper, almost unreal. Appointments that happen sooner because scheduling is automated, lab results that get triaged instantly, doctors who finally look you in the eye because the computer is quietly doing the paperwork, scans that are read with a second set of tireless eyes, and drug discovery timelines that stop feeling like geological time. The other corridor is darker and more dangerous. Clinical decisions influenced by an AI that sounds confident while being wrong, patients soothed by chatbots that can be nudged into misinformation, hospitals deploying tools they don't fully understand, and regulators tightening the screws because the stakes are no longer theoretical. That is the AI health revolution in 2026. The cost of certain kinds of medical work collapses, while the risk profile of certain kinds of medical judgment spikes. Let's make this concrete right away. In 2026, the cheapest thing in healthcare is going to be text. Not the content of what people say, but the act of turning messy human reality into structured documentation. The visit note, the letter, the summary, the billing-friendly phrasing, the referral, the discharge instructions that somehow have to be correct, readable, and legally defensible. For decades, healthcare spent money like water on the same invisible labor, clinicians translating their brains into documentation, and then translating that documentation into codes, and then translating those codes into claims, and then translating denials into appeals. That is a language problem, and once a system can listen, summarize, and format reliably, the economics change overnight. You're going to hear the phrase ambient AI scribe everywhere because it hits the pain point with surgical precision. It doesn't promise magic medicine, it promises time. The kind of time that shows up as fewer after-hours notes, fewer burned-out clinicians, more attention on the patient, and fewer missed details because the human brain is exhausted. There are already randomized and pragmatic trials testing these systems in real clinics, measuring documentation efficiency and burnout not in a toy setting but in the messy chaos of actual ambulatory care. And that's why this category is poised to get cheaper fast in 2026. It has a simple value proposition, a clear buyer, measurable outcomes, and it doesn't require the AI to invent medical truth. It needs to capture what happened and do it cleanly. Now, I want you to notice the pattern because it predicts what gets cheaper next. The tasks that become cheap are the tasks where the output can be verified with high confidence, where the cost of a mistake is bounded, and where the work is already standardized but painfully manual. Documentation, basic triage, routing, prior authorization drafts, summaries, patient instructions that pull from approved templates, translation across languages for known, bounded medical content. Even the first pass at imaging reads in certain contexts, especially as a second reader, that flags anomalies for a radiologist, rather than replacing the radiologist outright. The economic engine here is not AI is smarter than doctors. The engine is AI is relentless at the parts of medicine that are repetitive, and medicine is drowning in repetition. So in 2026, you'll see something else get cheaper, the cost of moving information through the system. And if you've ever dealt with healthcare, if you've ever watched a family member bounce between offices with the same forms, the same history, the same medication list, rewritten 10 times, you already understand how huge that is. When information moves faster, everything downstream accelerates. Referrals happen sooner, tests aren't duplicated as often, specialists don't waste time reconstructing the story, and the whole machine stops burning money on friction. But here's where the second corridor begins, because the same technology that makes text cheap also makes confident nonsense cheap. And in healthcare, confident nonsense is not a harmless bug, it is a clinical hazard. We already have evidence, real, documented examples, that generative AI systems can run with false information if a made-up term or a misleading premise is slipped into the conversation. In other words, one fictional detail can trigger a decisive, elaborate answer built on nothing. If you're using AI for homework, that's annoying. If you're using AI for medication advice, it's dangerous. And if you're using AI inside a clinical workflow, it's a systemic risk because it scales. A single failure mode replicated across thousands of interactions becomes a public health problem. This is why 2026 is not simply an AI boom year in health. It's a governance year. It's a prove-it year. The industry is moving from experimentation into accountability, and regulators are forcing the conversation to shift from hype to control. In the US, the FDA has been tightening its thinking around AI-enabled medical devices, especially the uncomfortable reality that these systems can change over time. Traditional medical devices are supposed to be stable. You approve a product, you lock it down, and updates are tightly controlled. But AI wants to learn, adapt, improve. So the question becomes, how do you allow improvements without turning every update into a new unregulated product? One major regulatory answer is the concept of a predetermined change control plan, basically a pre-approved plan for how the AI can be modified while maintaining safety and effectiveness. The FDA finalized guidance to provide recommendations for these PCCPs tailored to AI-enabled devices. Now, you might think this is bureaucratic, but it's actually the opposite. It's the infrastructure that makes safe iteration possible. And here's the twist that most people miss. As soon as regulators formalize how updates can happen, the market speeds up. Companies that can operate inside a clear framework move faster than companies in a legal fog. So in 2026, some things will get cheaper because regulation is clarifying the rails. But other things will get riskier because the rails make it easier to deploy at scale, and scale magnifies both benefits and harms. In Europe, the timeline is even more dramatic because the EU AI Act is not a guideline vibe, it's a sweeping legal structure. The EU itself states that the AI Act entered into force on 1 August 2024 and will be fully applicable on 2 August 2026, with stage obligations and later transition periods for high-risk systems embedded in regulated products. Reuters has also reported the European Commission pushing back on calls to pause the implementation timeline. No, stop the clock. Translation: in 2026, healthcare organizations operating in or selling into Europe feel a rising compliance gravity. That changes what gets deployed, how it's documented, and what kinds of claims companies dare to make. And this is where we need to draw a sharp line between two kinds of AI and health, because mixing them up is how people get hurt. Type 1 is workflow AI. It touches scheduling, documentation, administrative burden, summarization, and communications. It can be powerful, it can be transformative, and it can absolutely fail, but its failures are often detectable and containable. A note can be corrected, a summary can be reviewed, a workflow can be audited. Type 2 is judgment AI. It influences diagnosis, treatment choice, triage severity, medication decisions, or any recommendation that a human might accept because the system sounds authoritative. This is where risk grows teeth. It's not only about hallucinations, it's about trust dynamics. People overtrust systems that speak fluently. People undercheck when they're tired, and healthcare workers are tired. There are already peer-reviewed discussions focused on hallucinations specifically in the context of medical devices, because an error in that setting is not just misinformation. It can jeopardize patient outcomes through clinical decision-making. Researchers are also testing mitigation strategies like retrieval augmented generation, grounding outputs in vetted medical sources to reduce hallucinations. That's promising, but it doesn't eliminate the deeper issue. When you introduce a probabilistic language system into a domain where the correct answer is sometimes we don't know, you risk manufacturing certainty. And here's the uncomfortable truth that defines 2026. The system will get cheaper, faster than it gets safe, not because safety is impossible, but because cost reduction is driven by scale and competition, while safety is driven by cautious evaluation, governance, and incentives that are often misaligned. So if you're watching this thinking, okay, what exactly gets cheaper? I'll give you the preview, and then I'm going to show you the trap hidden inside it. In 2026, the cost drops hardest in 5 areas: documentation, patient communication, clinical operations, imaging support as a second layer, and parts of drug discovery and research workflows where AI can compress search and synthesis. But the risks rise hardest in 3 places: anything that resembles therapy without a therapist, anything that resembles diagnosis without accountability, and anything that uses private health data without rock-solid controls and clarity about who owns what. And yes, mental health is going to be one of the most emotionally charged battlegrounds. There are already medical discussions in 2026 describing both the therapeutic potential and the low-quality evidence landscape for generative AI chatbots in psychiatry, along with concerns about misuse and risk. This is exactly the kind of domain where a tool can help at the margins and harm in the center. Because the danger is not only incorrect advice, the danger is dependency, misplaced certainty, and the illusion of being understood. Now, let me open a loop that I promise I'll close in the next part. The biggest reason AI makes healthcare cheaper in 2026 is not the chatbot. It's not the robot doctor fantasy. It's something far more boring and far more powerful: the conversion of healthcare into an information supply chain that can be optimized like logistics. Once you see that, You'll understand why the winners of 2026 won't be the hospitals with the flashiest AI demos, but the ones that quietly redesign their entire workflow around verification, auditability, and what I call confidence budgeting, deciding exactly where the system is allowed to be probabilistic and where it must be deterministic. Because here's the killer question. If AI makes certain tasks nearly free, what happens to the business models built on billing for those tasks? What happens to the clinics that survive on volume documentation? What happens to the middle layers of healthcare whose job is literally to move forms from one place to another? Here's the uncomfortable math nobody wants to say out loud. In 2026, healthcare doesn't adopt AI the way it adopted electronic records. It gets reorganized by AI the way retail got reorganized by logistics and the internet. Not because medicine becomes a tech product, but because medicine is already an information factory pretending it isn't. Every diagnosis is a classification problem, every referral is a routing problem, every discharge is a handoff problem, every insurance decision is a documentation and criteria problem, every medication list is an error-prone synchronization problem between humans and systems that don't talk. So when AI drops the cost of reading, writing, sorting, and translating medical information, the biggest savings don't show up as a single AI doctor. They show up as a million tiny frictions quietly disappearing. That's what gets cheaper first. Friction. The cost of turning raw clinical reality into a clean, billable, auditable story. The cost of hunting through a chart to find the one detail that matters. The cost of rewriting the same instructions in 5 different tones for 5 different reading levels. The cost of compiling prior auth packets. The cost of creating summaries for handoffs. The cost of translating patient messages into something a clinician can safely act on. And yes, the cost of documentation time in the day-to-day sense, minutes that add up to hours, and hours that add up to burnout, turnover, and errors. The reason I'm so confident about this is that we're not guessing anymore. We're measuring. In a real-world, randomized implementation, an ambient AI system reduced clinician work exhaustion and interpersonal disengagement, and the conversation around scribes has shifted from cool demo to operational intervention. Another randomized trial comparing 2 ambient AI scribe platforms reported reduced time and note for one platform and potential improvements in burnout and task load, while also acknowledging the occasional inaccuracies that require vigilance. Read that last part again, because it's the theme of 2026. Productivity gains are real, and errors are real, and the winners are the organizations that engineer their workflow so errors get caught before they become harm. Now let's go deeper, because the real disruption in 2026 isn't AI writes notes. The real disruption is that once text becomes cheap, the entire billing and compliance machine gets reshaped. For decades, healthcare has been trapped in a strange loop. The system creates documentation partly for patient care, but also to satisfy coding, reimbursement, liability, and auditing. That created a massive hidden labor force, clinical and administrative, whose job is essentially translation between medicine, insurance rules, and law. When a machine can draft that translation in seconds, the economics of those roles change. Not instantly, not universally, but structurally. So what gets cheaper? The cost per unit of administrative throughput. One staff member can handle more messages, more forms, more drafts, more paperwork that was never really paper. Clinics that were drowning in portal messages, where every simple question stole minutes from a physician, can now triage, summarize, and route with far less human friction. But here's the trap. As throughput increases, demand increases. More messages get answered because it's easier, more follow-ups happen because the barrier is lower. The system can get more efficient and still feel just as overwhelmed because cheap communication encourages more communication. In 2026, a lot of healthcare organizations will celebrate AI saved time and still feel exhausted because they didn't redesign the workflow to control the new volume, and that's where things get riskier. The first major risk category in 2026 is automation without accountability. It's the quiet moment when a draft becomes a decision, when the AI's summary becomes the only thing the clinician reads, when a triage suggestion subtly nudges urgency up or down, when a system that was supposed to assist becomes a default authority because everyone is too busy to double-check. This isn't science fiction, it's human factors. In high-stakes environments, humans drift toward trusting the tool that reduces cognitive load, especially when the tool speaks in crisp, confident language. We have direct warnings that chatbots can be prompted into running with false medical premises, even a single made-up term, then produce decisive, detailed responses built on fiction. That matters in consumer health, but it's more dangerous inside clinical workflows, because the system's fluency can disguise uncertainty. And when these failure modes scale, They don't fail as isolated incidents, they fail as patterns. A second risk category rises in 2026: hallucinations and error modes, specifically in medical device contexts, where outputs can influence diagnostic or therapeutic decisions. The literature on hallucinations in medical devices explicitly frames the concern. In high-stakes applications, hallucinations can influence clinical decision-making and jeopardize patient outcomes. The point isn't that AI will always be wrong. The point is that the cost of being wrong is unacceptable, so the system must be engineered to detect and contain wrongness, not merely to sound smart. So here's the economic paradox you need to understand. As certain tasks get cheaper, the cost of safety goes up. The cheaper the output, the more you need guardrails, because volume increases and mistakes propagate. In 2026, the price tag shifts from labor hours to governance, evaluation, monitoring, audits, documentation of model updates, incident reporting pathways, cybersecurity hardening, and legal review. These are not optional extras when you're dealing with protected health data and clinical decisions. They become the new operating cost of using AI at scale. That's why regulation becomes one of the most expensive forces of 2026. Not expensive in the sense of wasteful, but expensive in the sense of requiring real investment. In the US, the FDA's finalized guidance on predetermined change control plans is a signal that regulators are serious about the life cycle of AI-enabled medical devices, how they can be modified iteratively while maintaining safety and effectiveness. This matters because it forces manufacturers to treat updates as part of an approved, controlled process rather than a casual, "we pushed a new model last night" culture. In other words, no more magical upgrades without paperwork. That increases the cost of change, but it also increases trust, and trust is what unlocks broader adoption. In Europe, the calendar itself is a pressure wave. The European Commission's own timeline says the AI Act entered into force on 1st August 2024 and is fully applicable on 2nd August 2026, with staged obligations and certain transition periods for high-risk systems embedded in regulated products, and major reporting indicates the Commission has rejected calls to delay the rollout, confirming there is no stop the clock. So in 2026, you'll see organizations behave differently depending on where they operate. Some will slow deployments, some will redesign systems to meet high-risk requirements, and some will shift towards safer categories like workflow automation because the regulatory burden is lower than for decision-critical use. Now zoom out, because a third risk category in 2026 isn't medical error, it's data. Health data is a magnet. It's among the most sensitive categories of personal information, and it's valuable in ways that attract both legitimate innovation and relentless abuse. When AI becomes deeply integrated into clinical operations, the attack surface expands. You don't just secure a database, you secure prompts, logs, integrations, model outputs, vendor pipelines, and the messy reality of staff copying and pasting information into tools. And because the benefits of AI are immediate, organizations will be tempted to move faster than their security posture can support. That's why risk frameworks become practical tools in 2026, not academic checklists. The NIST AI Risk Management Framework is explicitly built to help organizations think across the lifecycle, mapping, measuring, managing, because AI risks are socio-technical. They emerge from the model, the data, the deployment context, and human behavior. And global health authorities have been emphasizing ethics, governance, and human rights in AI for health, because do no harm has to apply to systems as well as clinicians. So the organizations that win in 2026 will adopt a new rule. They will treat AI like a clinical instrument, not like a productivity app. And instruments have protocols. Instruments have maintenance. Instruments have calibration and quality control. You don't stick a new instrument into surgery because it looked great in a demo. You validate it. You define what it's allowed to do. You track failures. You train staff on safe use. You build redundancy. That's the mindset shift. Now I want to make you a promise. If you can remember one phrase from this entire video, make it this: verification is the new bedside manner. In 2026, patients will judge healthcare not only by whether they feel heard, but by whether the system is visibly safe. And the most trusted providers won't be the ones who brag the loudest about AI. They'll be the ones who can say with a straight face, "We use AI, but we never let it make an unverified leap." That trust becomes a competitive advantage. And this is where the cheaper versus riskier split becomes brutally clear. What gets cheaper in 2026 is anything that can be verified after the fact with low ambiguity. Summaries, drafts, translations of known content, operational routing, documentation, and second set of eyes. Support where a licensed professional remains the accountable decision maker. You'll also see public agencies accelerate experimentation in operational use cases, which pushes the ecosystem forward. For example, HHS has been publicly cataloging and expanding AI initiatives, reflecting how institutions are formalizing AI governance and use cases rather than treating them as scattered pilots. What gets riskier in 2026 is anything that looks like medical judgment without a robust safety envelope, direct-to-consumer diagnosis-like advice, mental health chat that drifts into clinical territory without safeguards, triage systems that silently shift priorities, and any use of AI where model outputs can't be audited or explained to a regulator, a clinician, or a patient in plain language. It also gets riskier when a healthcare system outsources its AI brain to a vendor without ironclad agreements on data handling, retention, and security, because then the organization has created a dependency, and dependencies are where failures become existential. Let me open the next loop because this is where part 3 becomes unavoidable. The biggest winners of 2026 are not determined by who has the best model. They are determined by who has the best deployment architecture. The winners will build what I call a two-speed system. One speed for cheap, high-volume text work that is heavily automated, and another speed for clinical judgment where AI is constrained, grounded, and constantly audited. They will also create a simple, powerful culture shift. Nobody is allowed to say, "the AI said so," as justification. Instead, the AI must point to evidence, or it must clearly label uncertainty, or it must step aside. If you strip away the hype, the AI health revolution in 2026 comes down to one brutal trade. The cost of producing medical text and coordination collapses, while the cost of trusting the wrong output rises. The cheap side is real, and it's already measurable. Ambient systems that reduce documentation burden and clinician exhaustion are moving from pilots to pragmatic trials and real deployments, and the operational logic is obvious. When you remove the tax of paperwork, the system breathes again. But the risky side is just as real. The same generative systems that can summarize a visit can also produce confident, detailed nonsense if they're nudged with a false premise. And the danger isn't a single bad answer. It's scale, repetition, and human overtrust when everyone is busy. That's why 2026 is the year the industry learns a hard lesson. AI in healthcare is not one thing. Workflow AI gets cheaper because it can be verified, audited, corrected. Judgment AI gets riskier because fluency looks like truth, and in medicine, truth must be earned. So the winners of 2026 won't be determined by who has the flashiest model. They'll be determined by who designs the safest system. The organizations that actually benefit will run a two-speed architecture. They will automate the low-stakes, high-volume tasks aggressively, documentation drafts, routing, summaries, structured intake, while putting the highest-stakes decisions behind friction on purpose, mandatory human sign-off, evidence grounding, clear uncertainty labels, and logging that can survive a compliance audit. And this isn't just a best practice vibe, it's where the regulatory world is going. In the US Food and Drug Administration has been explicit about lifecycle controls, like predetermined change control plans for AI-enabled device software functions, because updates can't be treated as casual patches when safety is on the line. In the EU, European Commission has laid out a clock that makes 2026 a compliance turning point. The AI Act entered into force on August 1, 2024, and the Commission's own materials tie full applicability to August 2, 2026, with staged obligations. Whether people love it or hate it, the direction is clear. Less tolerance for black box magic, more demand for controlled change, transparency, and accountability. And if you're watching this as a normal person, not a hospital executive, the practical takeaway is simple. You should expect some parts of healthcare to feel faster and cheaper, especially anything that is basically information movement, while you should be more skeptical than ever about anything that sounds like diagnosis or treatment advice coming from a generic chatbot. In 2026, the safest use of AI in health is when it is grounded, monitored, and constrained, when it acts like a tool inside a system, not a substitute for a system. That's why frameworks from National Institute of Standards and Technology and guidance from World Health Organization matter. They're basically telling the world that AI risk is socio-technical, and governance has to cover the full life cycle, design, deployment, monitoring, and human factors, because the failures are rarely just the model. Even U.S. Department of Health and Human Services is publicly cataloging AI use cases, which is another sign that the era of scattered experiments is ending and the era of formal oversight is beginning. So here's the real ending. In 2026, the future of health isn't AI replaces doctors, it's AI compresses the cost of coordination, and then the entire industry has to pay the bill for safety, verification, and trust. The care that gets cheaper will be the care that gets measured. The care that gets riskier will be the care that gets outsourced to fluency. And the only way to win that trade is to demand proof, not vibes. Because in healthcare, a confident sentence is never a guarantee. And in 2026, it's going to be cheaper than ever to produce one.